Welcome, everyone. Okay, I will start by introducing Laura as we let people trickle into this webinar. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We are pleased to have you for another session of Discovery. My name is Emily. I am the Engagement Manager with Efficiency Canada. Efficiency Canada operates within Carleton University. We acknowledge that the location of our campus sits on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. In doing so, we acknowledge that we have a responsibility to the Algonquin people and a responsibility to adhere to Algonquin cultural protocols. Before we get started, a reminder to everyone that our guest speaker will present for 20 minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions. Please use the question and answer, the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions. The chat should also be open if you would like to share some ideas or some links that don't really belong in the Q&A. So we have a hard stop at 12:45 Eastern time so that everyone can get to lunch. So we might not be able to get to all of your questions, but I think Laura will share her contact info in the chat for everyone if there are some remaining questions that you'd like to chat with her about. So I'm pleased to welcome our guest today, Laura. Laura is an assistant professor of environmental studies at the University of Toronto Scarborough. She runs the Impact Lab, a community-based and policy-engaged research group focused on climate change policy and action. Her research on energy justice focuses on how we can catalyze equity-oriented energy transitions. In this session, Laura will present recommendations for how energy retrofit programs can play a role in effectively addressing energy poverty based on a collaborative research project that involved interviews with program administrators for low-income energy retrofit programs all across Canada. So welcome, Laura, and over to you.
Thanks so much. I'm really happy to be here and to be speaking with everyone today about this research and what we found and when we were talking to program administrators across the country. Let me just get my screen shared here. Okay, so I've titled this talk How to Catalyze Equity-Oriented Energy Transitions, because we're really thinking about how we can have energy retrofits that reach Canadians that need them the most, lower income Canadians across the country. This is, as Emily mentioned, this is a collaborative research project, and so I want to thank and recognize my co-authors, collaborators on this project, Guillaume Baggio, Abby Cantamneni, and Hannah McRae. So this is a group effort, this research project. So let me start with a little bit of context about why we need equity-oriented energy retrofits. Energy poverty in Canada has become a national challenge, with data sources pointing to energy poverty levels that range from 6% to well above 30%, depending on how you calculate it or where in the country you're talking about. So energy poverty and inadequate housing conditions are really burdensome realities that are affecting a lot of people in Canada. And they've frequently been linked to low household income, high and recurrent energy bills, and energy inefficient homes. So because of that, public authorities and governments have tried to improve access to energy retrofits to improve efficiency in ways that lower energy bills. But a lot of low-income households face challenges in accessing general energy retrofit programs, ones that are meant for anyone. And this is because they're designed in ways where they often require the household to have good credit, cash up front to be able to pay for retrofits that they're then reimbursed. They require fluency in English and honestly quite a bit of time to be able to navigate and implement and manage it yourself successfully. So there are a lot of those, and those lead to a lot of challenges in many homes being able to actually have an upgrade to their home that would improve their energy bills. Now, there are energy retrofit programs that have specifically targeted low-income residents with fully or partially funded retrofit measures. And these are programs that are meant to reach households that would otherwise be excluded from market-based energy retrofit offers. And so that's what we focused on in this project, is looking at those programs in Canada. And in many ways, though, the potential for energy retrofit programs to address energy poverty remains untapped. So because of that, we decided to do this project. And what we did is we conducted interviews with 11 energy retrofit experts, including managers of utility and provincial programs across 8 Canadian provinces. And we were interested in finding out more about the extent to which energy retrofit programs for low-income households, whether they're comprehensively accounting for the socioeconomic, demographic, cultural structures that shape energy poverty experiences. We wanted to know more about what they're accomplishing, who they're reaching, and whether they're getting at the determinants of energy poverty. So to do that, we needed a way to think about what they would mean if they were addressing the determinants of energy poverty. And so we used this vulnerability-based approach for energy poverty, which invokes one or more risk factors contributing to energy poverty, because we really were thinking about the way that vulnerability to energy poverty results from the reinforcements and intersections of all sorts of different risk factors. And we've categorized them here into 3 components. So these are kind of serving as our proxy for the determinants of energy program. And these are the things that energy retrofit programs may address if they're taking this vulnerability-based approach. So let me talk a little bit about each of these 3 components. On affordability, this is the risk factor where unaffordable energy bills often compel low-income households to make difficult choices between living comfortably and safely and in healthy ways, healthy buildings, having to choose between that and paying for utilities or affording other critical living expenses. So there's situations where these challenges can perpetuate a cycle of economic hardship and really magnify pre-existing disparities within underserved communities. The burden of the financial burden from unaffordable energy costs can really restrict low-income households from accessing employment or being able to benefit from educational opportunities. So in this context of, affordability challenges, upfront costs are a major barrier that hinder access to energy retrofits for low-income households. But energy retrofit programs can address affordability issues by recognizing these financial constraints and vulnerabilities and, specifically targeting to households that are vulnerable, like low-income individuals and families, those in precarious employment, those burdened by high household debt, so that programs are focused on this affordability challenge. The second component I want to talk about is called poor housing conditions here. It's that circle there. And this relates to the state of the home. Addressing energy poverty requires evaluating and addressing housing conditions. So, for example, homes that are older are often less energy efficient. They might not have, a proper insulation, and it's more expensive to live there. It costs more in energy costs to live in older homes. Structural damage in homes can compromise energy efficiency as well, contributing to heat loss. So you can have energy poverty drivers coming out of the condition of the home as well. So you can see the ways that housing condition and affordability challenges can intersect to lead to energy poverty. The last component we have up here we call systemic marginalization. So this is about systemic exclusion and barriers. Energy retrofit programs can recognize and act on these systemic marginalization and exclusionary dynamics. And what this would look like would mean identifying populations that are overlooked by current retrofit initiatives, like renters and residents of multi-unit buildings are often not targeted by retrofit programs. It also means recognizing and addressing barriers faced by newcomers and minorities, so language barriers or informational access challenges, that kind of thing. So policies or programs that are trying to reach underserved communities would do things like broaden eligibility criteria to try to bring a more diverse range of vulnerable houses into the scope of energy efficiency initiatives. So what this does, the reason I've gone through this, is it gives us a framework to think about what we would be seeing if programs were addressing the determinants of energy poverty. So now I want to tell you a little bit about what we found in our research and tell you a little bit about it, and I'm going to sort it with those three components in mind. So I'll start here with affordability. What we found when we looked across Canada, across 8 provinces, We found that current programs are using household income thresholds to determine low-income eligibility. They're often using Statistics Canada provincial data for income thresholds, and they're using that to determine eligibility to the program, so that low-income cutoff. Some programs, however, are using boosted eligibility in one way or another. They've increased the household income that is eligible to the program, or they've used other data thinking about more widely about costs that households are facing to think about eligibility for the program. Programs targeting renters also kind of calculate eligibility. Some of them calculate eligibility by thinking about the proportion of household income that goes towards rent, to think about whether the renters that live in that building are vulnerable to energy poverty as well. And so some other energy poverty dimensions are sometimes used in some programs. That said, though, most of the low-income energy retrofit programs in Canada have a relatively limited eligibility approach, where they're excluding household expenditures, like things like food costs and childcare. They're thinking mostly about energy costs, for example, or they're thinking using provincial data to think about the incomes for the households. And one of the things that the program administrators and other experts told us was that you setting these household income thresholds to decide whether or not a home qualifies to be retrofitted, it can be really limiting, because those income thresholds they're based on data that's a few years ago and it's average. So it doesn't consider the living cost trends, the increase in inflation, the increase in energy costs that we've seen the last couple of years. And that's why some of the programs have this boosted eligibility. They're recognizing that the setting a threshold using average data from a couple of years ago, maybe setting the threshold too low. They also pointed out to us that using broad province-wide income data as a inclusion or exclusion can disqualify a lot of potential homes that might need these retrofits as well, because it's a big average. It doesn't maybe represent an energy poverty lived experience in a particular urban area or a particular rural area, although there are challenges in getting more disaggregated, more location-specific data as well. There were programs that were targeted toward renters, low-income programs targeted towards renters, but not many. And so the fact that we have that missing in the kind of suite of many low-income retrofit programs across the country means we're not reaching a big proportion of potential households that are vulnerable to energy poverty. Now, when we're thinking about affordability, one thing that was really interesting was the way that in our interviews, experts brought up the question of affordability for who. Who is getting affordability improvements through retrofits? And this quote's talking about affordability improvements that maybe aren't significant for the household. So what they're talking about here is that if you've got a program that's focused on energy savings across an entire portfolio, like across a whole utility, across the whole province, then that might mean that you go for energy savings in each particular building that are relatively small. It adds up to a lot, but each particular building only gets a small amount of savings. And when you think about that in the context of variability of bills, it's higher and lower at different times of years, any energy savings that low-income household gets, it's too small to really matter for affordability for household terms. The second component I brought up when we think about whether programs are addressing determinants of energy poverty was to think about the ways that they're addressing poor housing condition. Now, the programs where we talk to folks, they have energy, they vary in what kind of measures they support, that they pay for in different homes. And they vary from shallow retrofits, micro solutions, to deep retrofits, including energy switching and enabling services like panel upgrades, that kind of thing, so that they can put in heat pumps, that sort of thing. So there's a big range in what change we're talking about to housings. And we also found that the energy retrofit program mandates, almost all of them they had mandates that were really focused on reporting on energy efficiency gains, and or greenhouse gas emission reductions. That was the kind of bottom line reporting back to the funder. They had affordability parts too that they were trying to achieve, but most of the programs really had to think about the efficiency gains, especially if they were utility funded. And more often, if they were provincial government funded, they'd be thinking about greenhouse gas emission reductions as well and how much they're achieving across the program. Most of the programs across the country rely on an energy audit to determine what a particular residence's energy efficiency needs are and what kinds of measures should be funded for that particular home. And there was a variation in the decision making that goes into what a home is going to get from a retrofit program across the country. But the energy audit was a main tool that was used to decide about that. Now, this kind of brings up a few challenges in terms of addressing energy poverty. One is that the program administrators told us that they lack the ability to retrofit certain house types. Like, for example, a really old house where it's going to be really expensive to retrofit it might not end up being retrofitted in a program, or maybe not getting everything that it might need because it's just too expensive for the program to be able to do. They're trying to reach multiple homes. In other cases, it could be a new home, but a new home where the garage is sucking all the energy out, and there's no insulation in the garage, so it's sucking all the heat out of the home. But they don't cover that particular measure, so that home is no longer eligible for the retrofit program. Another thing that came up again and again was the limited ability to tackle health hazards that came up in the context of the energy retrofit. So often when you're tearing apart walls and that kind of thing, you come across mold, you come across asbestos. Some programs do have a small amount of funding, but they really stress to us that it's a very small amount that they have available overall and for each home. So if a home had it was too poor quality, it ended up being disqualified because they didn't have the money to address the health hazards that would have been unleashed as they started to do this renovation. Programs mainly target cost beneficial upgrades, but the ways that they calculate cost benefit are complex and I can get more into this in the questions and answers if you're interested. But what was brought up to us in the interviews was that this kind of analysis of a cost benefit approach can limit effectiveness in terms of what measures it points the program towards and whether or not they're matched to the needs of the low income residents. I think an interesting takeaway from this kind of pillar was kind of represented by this quote. When a lot of households that are drawn to these programs, they want to participate in the retrofit programs, want to because of their poor housing condition. It's drafty, it's not comfortable, it's causing health impacts. They want their home to be upgraded. But what people brought up to us is that they have to walk this fine line in housing need. The people that are coming to these programs have core housing needs, but if their housing needs are too great, beyond what energy efficiency is a mandate to solve, then they're excluded from the programs. If their condition's too good, maybe they're not vulnerable to energy poverty. So they've got to fit this narrow band of housing need in order to fit with the low income energy programs across Canada. Now, when it comes to systemic marginalization, what we found in the current programs across the 8 provinces was that some of the programs were recognizing the importance of trust and cultural background, working with the cultural background of the communities in order to successfully implement energy retrofits. And they were doing this with things like learning supports, translation, working with different supports for newcomers and immigrants maybe that aren't familiar with energy retrofits, so that they were having more successful program implementation. In the same way, some programs are using community-based approaches in order to engage with, to reach low-income residents, because it takes a lot of trust and a lot of work to be able to physically get into people's homes. What they brought up to us, though, is a lot of program managers feel that they don't have that comprehensive of approach to really understand, but also address systemic and structural disadvantage of low-income residents during their energy retrofit work. And another challenge that came up several times was that the traditional ways that we evaluate energy retrofit programs may not be that suitable for low-income programs, because they don't take a very comprehensive view of the impacts of energy retrofits. If you're calculating just the energy savings, but these are programs that have a suite of complementary benefits if you're thinking about ones that are successfully addressing vulnerability to energy poverty. So I want to kind of pull a few key highlights out of that in terms of what we can learn about catalyzing equity-oriented energy retrofits, and then talk about it in a kind of policy recommendation context. First, one of the key takeaways is that affordability defined across program terms, across a big picture terms, does not lead to retrofit programs that are addressing the determinants of energy poverty. So if you're thinking about province-wide cost benefits, improvements in energy savings, it leads you to kind of logic where you're trying to achieve shallow retrofits in lots of buildings. And maybe people get $8 a year savings on their energy bills, but you're not thinking about affordability defined in the household's terms. Also, another key takeaway related to this was the need to think about eligibility. For whom is an energy retrofit unaffordable? Can we think about wider expenses beyond the energy bill to think about who might not be able to afford to do an energy retrofit? And can we learn from this experience of expanding eligibility to middle income and to others who would not be doing a retrofit otherwise? There's a lot of policy innovation happening in this space, but what we found and what people brought up to us in conversations was that the retrofit programs are not being used to their full potential. Poor quality homes are being excluded. Large swaths of Canadians are not being reached, like most renters, for example. And kind of the flip side of this, of what we would need to do in order to use retrofit programs to their full potential, is to think of a holistic approach that's linking energy poverty and housing vulnerability. We can think about these concepts as linked, and when we do that, it makes sense that programs need to be widened to do more things, to bring in more actors, to bring in more funding. Also, to make sure that we're not accidentally making housing vulnerability worse through retrofits, like a retrofit for rental housing that ends up increasing rents because there hasn't been the accompanying tenant protection and rent protection for that building. So let me just phrase some of these as policy recommendations, and then we'll go to questions. So the recommendations coming out of this work were to think about expanded eligibility approaches. They're already happening in some places across the country, but thinking about recognizing household expenditures linked broadly to housing vulnerability, not just energy, and following some of these practices about increasing the income thresholds, because setting it too low means there's all sorts of people who just will never be able to do an energy retrofit. So trying to find that threshold where you are reaching households that can't afford to do it. Another key policy recommendation is to continue with expand the no-cost deep retrofit programs for low-income households. There are programs across Canada that are still doing just partial cost covering, which means they're not accessible to the lowest income households because there's no cash available. We know that from research, that's a major barrier to be able to participate. And existing programs should also be expanded with more funding as well. These are retrofits for homes that have a lot of social benefit across many dimensions, but they're also homes that are not going to be retrofitted unless we have no-cost deep retrofit programs. So this is a big argument for increasing the funding in this way. To do that, though, we really have to think about that point about affordability for households instead of using this energy savings approach, to think about how we incentivize those deep retrofits for households that really deliver the savings for residents. I've said it a few times that we need more programs that target renters and ones that are accompanied by tenant protection. And I think there's a lot to learn in policy recommendations in terms of learning from the community-based approaches to engagement, to working with local champions, to working with existing organizations that are already working in low-income zones. And then finally, the last recommendation I'll say is the need to develop more holistic approaches to programs. So in our interviews, people talked about how can we have more multi-outcome programs? They recognize those are really hard to design and deliver, but still we've got so many overlapping issues here. Are there housing programs? Are there health programs that we can combine together to have better programs overall? To do that, though, we really need to think about more comprehensive methods for evaluating these programs that have these multidimensional outcomes. So thank you so much for your attention today. I really appreciate it. I'm really happy to have opened this up for discussion and questions. I've got my email on there and I'll put it into the chat as well. Let me just pull down my share screen so I can see everything here.
Thank you, Laura. That was a great presentation. We do have a few questions in the Q&A box, but I would encourage everyone to post more questions in there so that we can really get everything out of Laura while we have her. So the first question I have here is from Brendan. The Federal Energy Efficiency Program is restricted to heat pumps. What is being left out with that approach? And is it actually trying to solve people's problems and meet their needs?
Okay, thanks, Brendan. I'm glad you brought up heat pumps. It was really interesting to have discussions with all these different programs about heat pumps. And I'll bring up a couple different things about it. One was there is some hesitancy to do electrification in low-income programs because people are concerned about the changes in operational costs, switching to electricity bills rather than fossil fuel bills. And people were really sensitive to that, but that doesn't mean that the programs are excluding electrification. Though there are programs that are paying for heat pumps for folks. One thing I want to bring up though is that there's a danger in stranding fossil assets in low-income homes if we avoid electrification for low-income homes. Like at a certain point, we know that we have to transition away from fossil powered heating and cooling in homes. It has to move towards electrification if we're going to be successful in climate impacts. And so we don't want to end up with a scenario where all middle and high income homes are now electrified and only the low income homes have these new furnaces that have been bought through our low income program. So I think there's a danger there in that we're stranding fossil assets in people's homes. But I think people are really sensitive trying to figure out it's hard to figure out, what problem are we trying to solve in the short term? And for most people, it's that energy bill that they're receiving monthly.
A question from Stella. Are there any retrofit programs that include renters for us to reference?
Yes, there are. There's a renter program in the East Coast. I'm just going to see if I can pull up the name for you because I don't have it at the top of my head. That is a renter program that also has a rent protection agreement in it, which I think is key. So it's a program where if a landlord participates in it, they have to agree not to raise rents for a certain period of time. I'm going to have to put it in the chat, the name for you though, so that I can make sure that I'm telling you the right one.
Awesome. There are two questions here that are referring to metrics. So can you please provide references for some program evaluation research that you reviewed for your own research and metrics that you use to evaluate these programs?
I'm not sure I know what you mean. So the program evaluation, what we did with this research, the design of it was not a evaluation of program outcomes. The design of this research was qualitative interviews with experts that are involved in retrofit programs across the country to try to understand the aims, design, and implementation challenges and opportunities. And the way that we analyzed those findings was using the vulnerability-based approach to energy poverty. All of these programs have different program evaluation as part of their operation as well. What we wanted to do was not to just repeat those program evaluations, but try to get at expert opinions about who these programs are reaching and how they might be changed, not just whether they're reaching their goals.
Could you give an actual example of a home where public health and energy efficiency programs could work together?
Sorry, say that again. An example of a home?
Of a home where public health and energy efficiency programs could work together. So perhaps intersection of health and these retrofit programs.
Sure. So the most common issue that came up related to health was the asbestos and mold remediation in homes, and the lack of funding for health related intervention, with funding focused only on energy efficiency instead. So what was suggested to us by experts was, are there ways that a health program and agency could pair funding with an energy efficiency program? So if a home was identified as having too significant of a mold problem, that there was health related funding that was able to pay for that before the efficiency program went in. So that's an example of a health concern that comes up a lot. Same thing with asbestos remediation in homes was another thing that came up. But they also brought up hoarding as well as a barrier in trying to actually implement the energy retrofit programs rather.
Jasmine is asking about some examples of effective community-based outreach approaches. What are some of the risks with this approach? For example, building trust and suggesting that savings will materialize despite there being some uncertainty, and how can these be addressed?
Yeah, good question. So the community-based engagement approaches that we heard about in a couple of different programs were longer term relationships with organizations that work in a direct way with homes that are likely to be eligible for the program. And so it wasn't a one-off dissemination of a program offering kind of model where you're kind of trying to send out materials to lots of folks and they hope that they disseminate them. Instead, it was longer term partnerships working together to try to do outreach to homes to show them that they might be eligible for that program. Yes, there are some risks that the way that the program is presented to folks is not exactly the way that the program operates. But I think the key thing there was that it's the connection and relationship building between the efficiency program and the community organizations was ongoing, and like there had to be trust building there as well as trust building between the residents and the organization that was reaching out to them. There are also programs that hire people so that they work for the program or related education programs that are from that community, the kind of community champions model, so that there's a direct link between the program and local champions. And I think what programs that were using this model told us is that they needed this trusted messenger in order to actually have households be interested in the program. Otherwise, there's so much distrust and suspicion that they would never walk through the door.
Thanks, Laura. Do you have any recommendations for service organizations to better advocate for wider eligibility criteria for the rebate programs to include renters and no-cost evaluations for low-income households?
Yeah, so that's great. I hope that lots of people do that. So what I talked about today, we are also writing up in a lot more detail so that we share some specific criteria that different programs are using to be able to expand eligibility. I think the key thing on renters is that it's not so much eligibility. The key thing on renters is that there are very few programs that are trying to reach them at all. The key things I would say is that there should be a program. That's what I would advocate for. And I would also advocate for a retrofit program with accompanying tenant protection measures. Efficiency Canada has a great report on that if you want more details about what specifically to ask for. That legitimate plug, they didn't tell me to say that at all. There's a really good like renter-oriented program, a report rather, for that one. And then expanding eligibility. Why don't I say that I'm happy to chat more about the programs that have worked on expanding eligibility. What I would probably recommend is taking an example from another provincial program that has expanded eligibility and advocating for that in wherever you're located, because it gets quite technical quite quickly about the way that you're defining eligibility.
Awesome. This question, I'm not sure was part of your research, but perhaps you have thoughts. Could you define deep retrofit specifically? What's the goal? Is it the same goal or definition that is used in mass market? I think there's some ACH of X, which I'm not sure what that is referring to, but is it 50% reduced energy use, or what are you aiming for?
Yeah, so I don't have a definition that I was using in this presentation because what people were calling a retrofit that they offered varied so significantly. And that's one thing that we're writing into the longer version of this paper, is to talk a little bit about the range, because it's a spectrum all the way from light bulbs to pulling furnaces, replacing windows and doors, envelope improvements, and that kind of thing. And then what they're aiming for in the program, like how much energy efficiency improvement they're aiming for, varies as well, even within a particular program, because often what they're trying to do is optimize some balance of the most measures that they can get for a certain cost benefit outcome, given the social benefit outcomes they're trying to optimize for that home. So there's not even most programs aren't even operating with a sort of, we get over this amount and then we've got an appropriate retrofit every single time, because they are balancing in each one. What kind of generally what I meant when I said we need deep retrofits is we need retrofits that are doing that list that I mentioned, are considering fuel switching, are thinking about envelopes of, not thinking about, are actually improving envelopes of buildings, and are doing those interventions in the homes depending on what they need. Insulation, windows and doors, fuel switching. That's the kind of scope of what I had in mind when I said deep retrofit here today.
Awesome. Sarah is asking, how do you suggest we bring multiple funders together to coordinate and simplify stacking funding for holistic housing retrofits that address health, safety, and energy conservation?
Excellent question. Before I answer that, I just put my email address again into the chat function, and I see that Brendan has answered with the link in there to the East Coast Renter program. Thank you, Brendan. It's hard to look it up while I was answering. So stacking, yes, that is a serious program design challenge. One thing that came straight from the experts that we spoke to, an idea, a suggestion, was to implement that stacking in a way where there was a case manager for households, so that the part of the linking of these different programs happened through a case manager interaction with a household in order to navigate the various needs of that household. In addition, stacking and linking would have to take place as well. And I think that's a challenging program design, but not unprecedented by any means. So the function of the way that it happens is going to vary a little bit across the country, depending on what existing programs are in place. And so a lot of the things that would need to be stacked are programs that vary by province. But I think it's going to have to be a relatively ground up stacking, and that we need to create some new streams of funding, I think, in order for them to be able to link together effectively. I'm not just speaking about, we've got 3 great programs and we just add them up together. I think there's going to be some new program creation that would have to happen in order to effectively get at that housing vulnerability and energy poverty intersection.
Philip is asking, and this has been upvoted, so it's an important one, if you have any comment on whether energy performance contracts would work for low-income households or groups of households.
Energy performance contracts. The problem with energy performance contracts is that the household doesn't benefit from the energy savings. Whoever paid for the energy upgrade gets the energy savings, like the saved cost. That's how it's paid off over time. And in this case, we really need these homes to get the energy savings. We need them to save the money themselves. We need their bills to be lower. they're already paying twice as much in their energy costs compared to their income as the average Canadian home. We need to get that back down to a manageable level. So having them continue to pay a high energy bill, and having that, the difference go towards the company that offered the energy performance contract doesn't address that issue of affordability improvements for the household that's vulnerable to energy poverty.
Okay, one last question before we finish off here. Amy is asking if you can provide any examples of programs that are using the determinants of energy poverty to define eligibility or qualify for a program.
Good question. I think the interesting thing that we found in this program, or in this analysis, was that across the country, there are programs that are innovating in different ways for different components related to energy vulnerability. It's not that there's one standout one that's doing all of these things necessarily. There's some that are doing it maybe more than others. It's mostly that if we can combine those learnings, then all of the programs would be doing a better job of addressing the determinants of energy poverty. So in one place they're doing really well with the community engaged outreach, in another place they're doing really well with expanding eligibility and thinking about wider household expenditures. In another place they're doing a really good job with getting at the deep retrofits with the housing affordability component. So there's not one to point to as doing all of the things, but I think the encouraging thing is that across the country, all of these programs have found ways to get at most of one or two of these elements really, really well. So I think, if we share that learning and replicate that learning across the country and make changes so it's possible to do those things in other places, then we would be in a much better place for the programs to be addressing the determinants of energy poverty.
Thank you, Laura. This was a great conversation. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for answering all these questions. And thank you to the audience for all these great questions as well. This session was recorded and it should be posted on our YouTube channel by next week. You can find our upcoming discovery sessions on our website under events, under the events tab. In the meantime, you can stay connected by joining our mailing list for other energy efficiency developments and research from across the country. So again, thanks for joining us today, Laura, and everyone online, and happy Friday. Have a good weekend. Bye.